Well, thank you. That fact about me is often trotted out in an introduction and has never been used as a compliment previously, so I'm very grateful that it has been. Look, in 7 minutes, I just want to touch on 3 different areas to address this point about a European framework that is really able to compete in the global marketplace. The first area I want to talk about is how single and unified does the single market have to be? Secondly, should the European Union's approach be to free trade beyond its borders, beyond the continent of Europe? And thirdly, how should the European Union approach innovation, new technologies, and specifically competition policy? How single, how unified should the single market be? I think one of the issues clouding the debate in the United Kingdom is a failure to understand the difference between a single market arrangement and a simple free trade area. The former, of course, is an immensely more intense relationship. And I think the single market has many merits that encourage growth and trade within the European Union. When I was at university and the single market was introduced, my economics professor was a great enthusiast for it and talked me through all of the differences there were about the regulation of tractor production in across what was then the 12 member states of the European Union. It was bewildering. I can't remember them all now, but it was something like in Portugal, the ratio between the front wheels and the back wheels had to be exactly 2 to 3. In Belgium, the thickness of the glass on the front windscreen had to be exactly ½ an inch. In Finland, there needed to be an escape hatch on the top of the tractor. Why people in Finland couldn't just get out of the side door like everybody else still bewilders me. But the point of the story was to say that it was nearly impossible to actually build a tractor economically that could be sold right across the European market, and therefore one set of regulations was enormously preferable to 12 or potentially 28. I think there is a lot to be said for that case, but I think a matter of balance needs to be introduced. I don't believe that the single market needs to end with total regulatory tax conformity right across all 28 member states. I think you need to make sure that member states are not erecting unreasonable non-tariff barriers to internal trade, but that's a rather different issue. And I think that the European Union is in danger of actually undermining policy competition between member states. We do not need, whatever your issues, whatever your views are on the topic, it seems to me bewildering that the European Union actually has a tobacco products directive, for example. Whether you believe there should be more intervention in reducing smoking or less, the fact that that's now an EU directive to determine to the precise millimetre what health warning is on a packet, to my mind, is regulatory conformity gone too far. We can allow that at member state level. Similarly, on tax and in the employment market, if, for example, France wishes to spend 57% of GDP in the public sector and the UK wishes to go for 35%, something like that, we shouldn't have a European Union intervention that determines that we both need to get to a uniform point. Similarly with working hours. If the French proposition is that very high public spending and a working week of 35 hours, maybe 30 hours, 20 hours, 10 hours is going to make them a more attractive place to do business, we should allow that competition between France and the UK. So I think plans for a revival of the common consolidated corporate tax rate, a continual push for uniformity in financial regulations, an effort by the Commission to make employment regulations a transnational issue are problematic. They are a completion of a single market, but do not allow competition within that market. Free trade outside of the European Union. Seems to me that the EU lacks something of a strategy here. What is the priority? To complete the market within the 28 or to open the market beyond the 28? So if you were looking at the protracted negotiations over TTIP, the transatlantic arrangement with the United States of America? Do we believe that the European Union is performing well here in opening up trade? I don't. So over the past decade, we've seen the EU sign, I believe it's 12 free trade agreements, the biggest of which have been with Colombia and Peru. No disrespect to those two countries, but during the same period of time, New Zealand has signed 10 free trade arrangements on its own behalf, including one with China, has recently concluded the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the USA, Malaysia, Singapore, Japan and Canada. Australia has signed free trade agreements with, amongst others, China, the USA, Japan, Korea, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, including Indonesia. So the EU has only managed to sign free trade arrangements with 2 of the 10 largest economies, excluding EU nations. Should there be a case that we would allow, given the European Union's relatively poor performance in this area, individual member states to reach free trade arrangements if we were able to bring in satisfactory rules of origin laws? Could it be that the UK would allow, I don't know, certain toys that have been created in China? They would need to be labelled as such, and those could be banned in France, Italy or Spain accordingly. Given the poor progress in that area, I think we should be open to that idea. Lastly, innovation and technology. The European Union is too minded to adopt the precautionary principle that if in doubt that something might cause harm, GM food, for example, our tendency should be immediately to regulate or possibly even ban it. Technology is now threatening, in a good way, I would suggest, to upend our whole economic order. The so-called sharing economy, the use of digital platforms in order to access new services is rendering much of EU competition policy, in my view, redundant and anachronistic. To take an example, the perfect example is Microsoft. In 2004, the European Commission concluded that Microsoft was too dominant in the operating systems market. Their share of the worldwide market was 95%. 10 years on, their worldwide share has plummeted to 20%. No thanks to any regulation changes or policy by the European Union. In fact, within the PC market, they still control about 90% of operating systems. But due to the rise of smartphones and tablets, their total market share is now 20%, a technological innovation that brought about competition in which, frankly, the European Union's intervention was certainly needless and possibly counterproductive. So, in conclusion, I think we need to be relaxed in some areas about the perfect completion of the single market. That's not an across-the-board approach. It may be that there are areas in which we do need to move towards some degree of greater unification of regulations, but not in all. And we need to strike a balance between having non-tariff barriers throughout the European Union and a single market basically functioning without a straitjacket of total conformity. We need to commit to a more open, much more trading European Union outside of its own borders and allow potentially flexibility at member state level there as well. And we need innovation to allow market entry, not strict competition rules. It was Angela Merkel, I think, who pointed out that the EU is 7% of the world's population, 25% of the world's GDP, and 50% of the world's welfare spending. That last number is largely due to policies made in member states, not at European Union level, but I think the real challenge for the European Union should be to get up that middle number, or more to the point, making sure our GDP per capita is as high as it can possibly be, and to find a policy framework that edges its member states in that direction, rather, which I fear it is doing in some areas at the moment, edging away from it. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark.